A potter in Kyoto once smashed 211 bowls with his own hammer before he sold a single one. Not because they were ugly. Not because they cracked in the kiln. He smashed them because they were almost perfect, and almost perfect was exactly the problem. I watched him do it to the 212th bowl myself, and I remember thinking he'd lost his mind. It looked flawless to me. Smooth curve, even glaze, not a single visible flaw. He held it up to the light for a long moment, turned it once in his hands, and then brought it down against the stone floor without any hesitation at all. I asked him why. He said something that took me years to fully understand, and once you understand it, the way you handle every failure in your own life is going to change. He said, if it's not going to fail eventually, it's not telling me the truth yet. I want to tell you what he meant by that, and the 400-year-old philosophy behind it, because most of us have the entire relationship with failure backwards, and it's costing us more than we realize. The potter's name was Hiroshi, and I met him in a small workshop outside Kyoto, the kind of place you only find because someone who trusts you tells you where to look. He'd been throwing pots for over 40 years, and by the time I met him, his work sold for more in a single piece than most potters make in a month. But that's not what made him interesting to me. What made him interesting was that he threw away more work than he kept. Not early in his career, when you'd expect it. Now, 40 years in, at the peak of his skill, he still smashed roughly 1 in 3 finished pieces before they ever left his workshop. I asked him once if it ever got easier, breaking something he'd spent hours making. He laughed, actually laughed, and said it had gotten harder, not easier, because now he could see flaws faster than his hands could stop making them. The more skilled he became, the more failures he could recognize, and the pottery hadn't gotten worse over 40 years. His eyes had just gotten better at finding the truth in it. That sentence sat with me for a long time. His eyes had gotten better at finding the truth in it. Not better at avoiding mistakes. Better at seeing them clearly, the moment they happened, without flinching. Here's the part most people get completely wrong about failure, and it's not just an old potter's opinion, it's been documented rigorously in modern psychology. Carol Dweck, a psychologist who spent decades studying how people respond to setbacks, found something that reshaped how we understand learning itself. She discovered that people generally fall into one of 2 relationships with failure, what she called a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. In a fixed mindset, failure feels like information about who you are. A mistake doesn't just mean you did something wrong, it means something is wrong with you, permanently, at the level of identity. And when failure feels like a verdict on your worth instead of a data point about your current skill, avoiding failure stops being a preference. It becomes survival. In a growth mindset, failure feels like information about where you currently stand, nothing more. It's a measurement, not a judgment. And the people who operate this way don't fail less often. This is the part that surprises people, they often fail more, because they're willing to attempt things a fixed mindset would never risk trying in the first place. Dweck's research found something specific and important here. Students praised for being smart, told their ability was the reason for their success, became more likely to avoid challenging problems afterward, protecting the identity of being smart instead of risking it. Students praised for their effort and process kept choosing harder problems, because their identity was never on the line to begin with. Hiroshi never once, in the entire time I watched him work, treated a failed bowl as evidence that he was a bad potter. He treated it as evidence about that specific bowl, in that specific attempt, nothing more. The failure never traveled upward into who he was. It stayed exactly where it happened, on the wheel, in that piece of clay, and nowhere else. This is where wabi-sabi actually enters the picture, and I want to be honest, most content that mentions wabi-sabi online gets it slightly wrong. It's usually reduced to something like appreciating a chipped teacup, finding beauty in imperfection, a kind of aesthetic nice to have. That's true, but it's the shallow end of a much deeper idea, and the deeper end is what actually matters here. Wabi-sabi grew out of Japanese tea ceremony culture, most closely associated with a tea master named Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century. Rikyu deliberately rejected the elaborate, flawless Chinese ceramics that Japanese nobility prized at the time, and instead favored rough, asymmetrical, visibly imperfect tea bowls, often ones that had been intentionally altered to look worn or incomplete. This wasn't an aesthetic preference in the way we think of it today, picking a distressed jacket over a new one. It was a philosophical position about what deserves to be called valuable. Rikyu's position was that an object which pretends to be perfect is lying to you, and an object that shows its own process, its own flaws, its own history, is telling you the truth about what it actually took to exist. Wabi refers to a kind of understated, humble simplicity, the beauty of restraint rather than excess. Sabi refers to the beauty that comes specifically from age, wear, and the passage of time, the patina on old wood, the visible repair line, the fade in a well-used fabric. Together, wabi-sabi isn't really about imperfection as decoration. It's about imperfection as evidence. Evidence that something real happened to this object. Evidence that it was actually used, actually made, actually lived, rather than manufactured to look untouched by reality. Now apply that same lens to yourself, to your own failures, and the entire picture shifts. A failure isn't a flaw in you that needs hiding. It's evidence that you actually attempted something real. The flawless version of you, the one who's never failed at anything, isn't actually more impressive. By wabi-sabi's logic, it's less trustworthy, because it hasn't been tested by anything real yet. I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this idea that gets twisted into something lazy, something that just excuses sloppy work by calling it authentic. That's not what Hiroshi was doing, and it's not what wabi-sabi actually teaches either. He wasn't keeping every flawed bowl and calling it beautiful. He was smashing most of them. The philosophy isn't that failure should be celebrated regardless of what caused it. It's that failure should be looked at honestly, without the panic and shame that usually makes us look away from it instead. There's an important distinction hiding in that difference, and it's the one that actually makes this practical instead of just poetic. Accepting failure doesn't mean lowering your standards. Hiroshi's standards were brutal, arguably higher than almost any potter I've ever watched work. What changed wasn't the standard. What changed was his relationship to missing it. When a bowl came out wrong, there was no internal collapse, no story about what it meant about him as an artist, no spiral. There was simply clear-eyed observation, a decision, and the hammer. Then he sat back down at the wheel and started again, usually within minutes. That speed matters more than almost anything else in this video. The gap between failing and starting again, for most people, gets filled with something heavy. Shame. Rumination. A story about what this failure proves about their future. For Hiroshi, that gap was almost empty. He'd built, deliberately, a mind that could see a failure clearly, extract exactly what it needed to extract from it, and move on without dragging the emotional weight of it into the next attempt. So here's how you actually build that same relationship with failure, because knowing the philosophy isn't the same as living it, and Hiroshi didn't start this way either. He told me it took him years, and it started with a very specific reframe he forced himself to practice deliberately. The first shift is learning to ask a different question the moment something fails. Most of us instinctively ask, what does this say about me? That question has no useful answer, and it almost always drags you toward shame. The question Hiroshi trained himself to ask instead was simpler and far more useful. What does this tell me about the clay, the wheel, the glaze, the temperature, the process? Not the self. The process. Failure has enormous amounts of specific, usable information locked inside it, but almost none of that information is about your worth as a person. It's about a variable in the actual process that didn't go the way you expected, and variables can be adjusted. Identities can't be adjusted nearly as easily, which is exactly why making failure about identity is so paralyzing. The second shift is building in the expectation of failure before you even begin, the way Hiroshi expected roughly a third of his pieces to break. This isn't pessimism. It's closer to insurance. If you expect a reasonable percentage of your attempts to fail, a failure doesn't feel like the system malfunctioning. It feels like the system working exactly as predicted. Decide in advance, honestly, what percentage of your attempts at something new are reasonably likely to fail, and let that number absorb the emotional shock ahead of time, instead of getting blindsided by it every single time. The third shift, and this is the one people skip because it feels almost too simple, is shortening the gap between the failure and the next attempt on purpose. Hiroshi's hammer came down, and within minutes he was back at the wheel. He told me the longer he let a failed piece sit in the room, the harder it became to start again, because the object itself became a small monument to the failure the longer it stayed visible. Whatever your version of that hammer is, whatever action moves you from the failed attempt directly into the next one, do it fast, before the story about what the failure means has time to fully form in your head. I went back to Hiroshi's workshop almost 2 years after that first visit. He was working on a new series, larger, more ambitious pieces than anything I'd seen him attempt before. I asked him how many he'd broken so far on this particular series. He said something like 18, out of maybe 50 attempts, and he said it the way someone might report the weather, completely without weight. Then he showed me the piece he was currently working on, easily the most striking thing I'd seen come out of his workshop. He said this one almost certainly wouldn't survive either. The proportions were experimental, he was testing a glaze technique he'd never used at this scale before, and he said it with something close to excitement, not dread. I asked him if it ever bothered him, spending so many hours on something that had real odds of ending in the hammer. He looked at me for a moment, and said the version of him that used to be bothered by that had stopped existing a long time ago. What replaced that person wasn't someone who didn't care about failing. It was someone who'd finally stopped confusing the failure of an attempt with the failure of himself. That's really the entire lesson, and it's simpler than the 400-year-old philosophy behind it might suggest. You don't build resilience by lowering what you're willing to attempt. You build it by getting honest, in advance, about the fact that a real percentage of real attempts are going to fail, and deciding now, before it happens, that the failure will stay exactly where it belongs. In the piece. In the attempt, never in your worth. The next time something you've worked hard on breaks, falls apart, or simply doesn't work, ask what the process is telling you, not what it's proving about you. Shorten the gap before you try again. And remember that the version of you who's never smashed anything, who's never actually risked a real attempt at something that could genuinely fail, isn't the safer version. By every measure that actually matters, it's the untested one. If this changed how you'll look at your next setback, subscribe, because next week I'm covering a Japanese principle about mastering one thing so completely that failure eventually stops being the risk it once was. And I want to know, what's one failure you're still carrying around as if it says something about who you are, instead of what it actually is? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.